Welcome back. So how are South Africa's largest cities sustaining themselves in a pandemic? The South African Cities Network believes that many lower-income homes are really unable to pay their taxes and tariffs as a result of the economic pinch that COVID-19 has brought about. In their 2020 State of Cities Finance Report, they recommend that it's now time that cities and municipalities start to scale back on levels of service so that they're more affordable. To tell us more about their findings, we are joined now by Danga Mughogho, the Program Manager at the South African Cities Network. Danga, a good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we want to start with some of your key findings here before we get into your very interesting recommendations. But 9 metros that you looked into, our biggest metros in the country, how are they faring?
Well, the metros, thank you for having me, first of all, and for the opportunity to speak to the South African Cities Network State of City Finances report. Our metros are doing well, considering the circumstances. So we all know that the country is suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact of that on the economy. And then also that, of course, is an economy within which the cities operate themselves. So what we've actually seen in this report is over the reporting period, which is roughly the last 3 years or so, the cities have actually, their revenues have increased by about 5.7% on average. Their expenditures have also increased, not surprisingly, by about 5.5% on average. And the difference between those two, so revenue being the money they get and expenditure being the money they spend, we see that a measure of that is operating surplus, and that has increased by about 4.2% over the last few years, as I said. So considering the economic circumstances that face the whole country and what cities operate in, it's fair to say that they're doing as best can be expected.
Yeah, how is that impacted on their ability to deliver services, which I know has been a challenge in many of our metros?
Well, it has had an impact in the sense that during the coronavirus period, of course, there's been an impact in terms of the number of municipal workers who are able to go to work, because, of course, municipalities were also affected by lockdown. But the ability to deliver services has not, in fact, taking away from that COVID, by our research, has not in fact been affected. And in fact, perhaps I should quibble a bit with your introduction there. Right. We were not suggesting in our report that cities should actually cut back on services in order to deal with the circumstances that they find themselves in. One thing they do find themselves in is they operate within what we call the local government fiscal framework, which of course is how money that's raised at the national level is distributed to cities in the form of grants and the local government equitable share, which is the part of the national fiscus that is about 9% of the budget, I think, on average. Yeah. And that is intended for cities to provide for basic services. And what we're finding is, because of some of the things that cities are also asked to do in addition to the many services they provide both to indigent as well as paying customers, that they're being pinched. And so we're saying that we need to look at the fiscal model in a slightly different way and perhaps examine some of the reasons why cities find themselves in that pinch.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that's why we needed to clear that up, right? Because essentially what you've got in a lot of municipalities is the lower income households are struggling to pay because they've lost their jobs over the pandemic. So when we start talking about restructuring that process of how municipalities get revenue and also spend, what are some of the recommendations that you put on the table on how we go about doing that? And perhaps it may be different in some municipalities.
Yes, well, first of all, we say that cities themselves, of course, should focus on revenue enhancement. So to the extent that they're able to collect all the revenues that are owed to them, National Treasury has a benchmark of about 95% of revenues owed in terms of municipal bills and so on. The pandemic has affected that because of the inability of workers to get out and perhaps collect those bills, so it's about 85%. So focus a bit on that. But typically, metros have done well in that area. They've typically been over 90% before COVID in any case. So that's not really a big area of improvement. However, one thing we are suggesting is that they can look at perhaps additional forms of revenue. And we're doing some work with the National Treasury Intergovernmental Relations. We've done some research into looking at additional forms of tax, for example. Has been suggested, but basically looking at other ways for cities to gain revenue from what they do now, which is predominantly from property rates, from selling electricity and water to residential and non-residential customers within their boundaries. So that's on the revenue side.
Right.
And then also to ask for an examination of some of the things that cities are actually asked to do. So their mandates. So they're actually being asked to do a considerable amount. About 40% of the population exists in urban areas, in our metros, and also 50% of economic activity. So wanting to have a greater conversation about enabling cities to do that.
I'm out of time, but thank you so much for speaking to us. I do think those are valuable suggestions on the revenue side that you have put on the table. Danga, thank you so much for speaking to us. Danga Mughogho, Program Manager at the South African Cities Network, talking about getting our biggest metros up to tip-top shape after the pandemic.